This is my first time talking about this book in Brussels, and I was a little apprehensive about coming here and talking to it because obviously it's a book that's quite critical of the EU, but sort of looking around the room, I'm sort of reassured you look like a very friendly bunch. What I'll do is I'll try to sort of give a rough outline of the argument in the book. There's kind of a lot in it, and so I'm going to whiz through it a little bit. And then we can get into any of the different aspects of it that you're particularly interested in the discussions, and maybe we'll pick up on some of it. Maybe before I start that, though, I'm going to say a little bit about myself and how I sort of came to write the book and the perspective I'm writing the book from, because that's actually how I start the book as well. And I do think that so much of how we think about Europe depends on sort of what perspective we're coming from. And so I want to sort of be transparent about the perspective I'm coming from. That starts with the fact that I'm British, right? Obviously Britain has a notoriously semi-detached relationship with Europe. And so, and I think that does make a big difference. I've worked a lot on Germany, as you were just saying. And I think, Europe just looks very different if you're on the periphery as Britain is compared to Germany, which is right at the centre, this famous German Mittellager. I just think that does make a big difference to how you think about Europe and the rest of the world, frankly. So that's part of it. But then on top of that, apart from the fact that I'm British and I was born and grew up in London, I've got two parents who were immigrants to the UK. So my father was Indian and my mother's Dutch. And so it's kind of a complicated kind of story because on the one hand, I think the fact that my mother's Dutch means that in some ways I felt actually, more European than a lot of Brits, more European than a Brit who has just two parents who come from Britain. But then on the other hand, as I say, my father's Indian, a country, outside Europe that was a British colony. And so I think as a result of that, I've always felt sort of partially European, but not completely European. So when I worked at the European Council on Foreign Relations, as you mentioned, some of my colleagues would say things like, I'm 100% European. And, that I could never really think of myself in that way. I feel partially European, but I also think of myself in some sense as being Asian. And so I think that perspective, or multiple perspectives, is sort of where I'm coming from, and I think gives me maybe a slightly different view of Europe and the EU than maybe some other people have, and you can decide whether that's a helpful perspective or not. So the book, it's about basically ideas of Europe. And, it goes all the way back to the medieval period when, the idea of Europe first started, or rather the idea of European identity and, the idea of people being Europeans first starts to emerge. And then it sort of tries to follow that story all the way through to the present day in the context of the European Union. So it really looks at the sort of evolution of ideas of Europe. And the sort of theoretical way, I won't spend too much time on this, but the sort of theoretical way in which I propose to think of the EU is as an expression of regionalism. A lot of pro-Europeans want to think that Europeanness and the EU is sort of the opposite of nationalism. And I think that's wrong. I think that it's an expression of regionalism, which is something like nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. So the project of sort of building Europe is actually, I think, quite analogous to, nation-building projects. And a big part of the reason why I think it's helpful, this idea of regionalism, that's analogous to nationalism, is what it means is that there's all of these intellectual resources that we have from the study of nationalism, which we can kind of apply to regionalism and to Europe. And I think that allows us to think in a much more granular, precise kind of way about, European identity and the European Union, some of the tensions within it. So in particular, what I use is this distinction that goes back to a book written in 1944 by Hans Korn on nationalism, which distinguishes between, on the one hand, an ethnic cultural nationalism, and on the other hand, a civic nationalism. And he sort of suggests that, for example, he suggests that the United States is a sort of purely civic nationalism. I think that's wrong. I think that, in the history of virtually every nation, at least the ones I'm familiar with, there's always this kind of mixture of ethnic cultural elements and civic elements. I think certainly we can see that now in the United States, perhaps more clearly than we could even a few years ago. And so I think that's also the story of ideas of Europe. That there's been this complex story of, on the one hand, ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, and on the other hand, civic ideas of Europe. So what I do, as I say, is I go back to, I start in the medieval period, when Europe is basically synonymous with Christendom, and what it means to be European is basically synonymous with Christianity. And, the external other against which Europe is defined at that time is clearly Islam. In the context of, centuries of conflict between Europe and Islam, between Christianity and Islam. That's fairly straightforward. I think, though, that idea of sort of Europe as Christian never really goes away. It kind of remains in the background through to the present day. One example I always give of this is that, the most prestigious prize for pro-Europeans is the Charlemagne Prize. Right, which, and Charlemagne is the embodiment of this medieval idea of European identity, which is synonymous with Christianity. And so, if what you want to say is that there's this completely new idea of European identity today that has nothing to do with these older ideas that are connected to Christianity, and Charlemagne is a slightly odd figure to pick as your kind of inspiration. Then, though, in the modern period, you get this much more complex new idea of Europe, which is partly to do with the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And so it's a much more secular, rationalist idea of Europe, of Europeanness, as opposed to a religious one. But here's the thing. It also emerges in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and in particular the Americas. And this is the context in which the idea of whiteness emerges. And so it's also a racialized identity, the modern version of European identity. And, this is not something that people really want to talk about, especially in the context of the European Union. And this is why I chose the title of the book as well, Eurowhiteness, to suggest Europeanness and whiteness have something to do with each other. And we ought to sort of think about that and talk about that. And so then the question becomes, and this is really the main question that the book is trying to answer, is, well, what does this new idea of European identity that emerges after 1945, in the context of European integration and what becomes the European Union, what does that have to do with these older ideas, and in particular the ethnic cultural ideas of Europe that are connected to Christianity and whiteness? And a lot of pro-Europeans would like to think they have nothing to do with those older ideas. This idea of 1945 as a kind of hour zero, or as the French philosopher Edgar Morin puts it, this is, Europe, a butterfly emerging from the chrysalis, right? But I think it becomes very clear when you look at the history that it's much messier than that. I mean, I've already mentioned the example of Charlemagne, but perhaps even more importantly than that, I think if you look back to the 1920s and the pan-European movement, all of the ideas that are that subsequently then become reality in the context of the post-war European projects are all already there in the interwar period, the pan-European movement. And, for example, the figure of Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, the first recipient of the Charlemagne Prize in 1950. And so then what becomes really interesting is those ideas of European integration in the 1920s, very much connected to European colonialism. And this idea of Eurafrica, Africa as Europe's plantation. This is the language that's being used, not just in the interwar period, but then subsequently in that early phase of European integration in the 1950s. And for those of you who don't know it, there's this fantastic book that I draw on, which every pro-European should read, and very few pro-Europeans have read, called Eurafrica by P.O. Hansen and Stefan Jonsson. It completely transformed my understanding of the early phase of the European project. And so it becomes very clear that, in that early phase of European integration in the 1950s, that part of the point of European integration is for France and Belgium to consolidate their remaining colonies in Western Central Africa at a time when they were no longer able to maintain them on their own. That was part of the point of European integration. I call this the original sin of European integration, consciously analogizing to the United States and slavery. Now, very quickly after that, those French and Belgian colonies become independent, roughly in 1960. And so then what I then do in the remainder of the book is to try to tell a story about what's happened in the European project since then. And I do it roughly in three phases, and I'll sort of run through those very quickly. So I think, first of all, there is this kind of emergence of, a more civic version of European identity, which is centred on things like the social market economy and the welfare state and the sort of depoliticised mode of governance that European integration produces. This becomes what, pro-Europeans, for a while think that Europe stands for. And one other thing, though, that happens, which is really crucial, is that, although those colonies become independent, they're very quickly, the history of European colonialism and the role of what becomes the EU in it is very quickly forgotten. It's sort of consigned to a memory hole. At exactly the same time as the Holocaust is increasingly becoming a really central collective memory for the European Union. So really, I think by the end of the Cold War, the Holocaust has become really, really central. Tony Judd, in his book Post-War, famously says, Holocaust recognition has become our contemporary European entry ticket. It's become a really central collective memory, and sort of, when pro-Europeans and the EU talk about what the EU stands for, and in particular the sort of lessons that it's learned from history, it's all about these internal lessons of European history. In other words, centuries of conflicts, particularly between France and Germany, culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. And the Holocaust fits quite neatly into that story because it happened in the context of World War II, right? But at the same time, what I call the external lessons of European history, in other words, not so much what Europeans did to each other, but what Europeans did to the rest of the world, never ends up, informing the European project in the same kind of ways. Not something that, European leaders, EU leaders ever talk about. Then in the post-Cold War period, there's this kind of expansive, optimistic moment for about 20 years, really, I think, when you have enlargement to include Central and Eastern European countries, and there's almost this kind of hubristic idea that the whole world can be remade in the image of the EU. Somebody wrote a book around that time called "Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century," which really captures that kind of idea. But the interesting thing is that although Europe's borders to the east become kind of porous as you have Central and Eastern European countries joining the EC at that, and then the EU. The borders to the south remain very hard. So, for example, Morocco applies to join the EC in 1987 and is just told flatly that you can't join because you're not a European state. So what I think actually happens is that the enlargement to include Central and Eastern European countries actually paradoxically strengthens this idea that the EU is a white bloc. Now, that optimistic, expansive period comes to an end with the Euro crisis in 2010, I think. And Europe goes into a much more sort of defensive kind of mode. You have the Euro crisis, then you have the Arab Spring, then you have this increasingly aggressive Russia, and the EU starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats, and it needs to protect itself from threats, and so protection becomes this kind of quite central kind of idea. And then I think the next really major critical juncture, which I think we're going to look back on really as being a really big turning point in the European Union, is the refugee crisis in 2015. And my argument in the book is that then what happens is that pro-Europeans start to interpret these threats to the EU in civilisational terms, in kind of cultural and civilisational terms. And, one example that I always give of that is that, the current European Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, which begins in 2019, there is a European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life, whose job is to keep migrants out. And I think that makes very explicit that migration, and here, by the way, of course, this means migration not from the east but from the south, is not just a difficult policy problem to be managed, but it's a threat to the European way of life. And interestingly, that phrase, the European way of life, had previously been used in the context of the things I mentioned earlier on, the social market economy and the welfare state, and this kind of idea of solidarity. That was once what the European way of life was, but I think now it means something much more sort of civilisational, and that's what I call the civilisational turn in the European project. And so one way of thinking about that, and this is sort of roughly where I end the argument about the EU in the book, is that these ethnic cultural elements of European identity, far from getting weaker, which is what you might have expected and what I certainly would have hoped, may actually be getting stronger.
Thank you, Hans, and also thanks everyone for being here. It's a Friday night and you've chosen to spend it chatting about light subjects like European civilisationism, so I appreciate you all being here. I'm going to be a sort of a discussant who, I'm going to pick up some of the points that Hans says, but I actually want to make an argument of my own, which is using Hans's framework and maybe adding to this concept of Eurowhiteness and adding another layer to it. And just before I start, I might just throw out some anecdotes about living in Brussels. And I think working in the EU institutions, again, being a Brit, so maybe having a slightly removed relationship with the project after Brexit, so I arrived after Brexit, it was self-evident to me that this civilisational thinking that Hans talks about is actually everywhere if you just pay attention to it. And I realised that this was an odd thing to say because most people around me were not noticing the stuff that I was noticing being said in throwaway remarks or the way the EU works. And one of my first sort of anecdotes that I never will really forget is I think it was the first European Council I ever covered. So a meeting of the EU's heads of state, to some people the most important institution in the EU, but we're not going to go there. And I was talking to one of the officials who, because there's a lot of downtime in these meetings, and he was explaining to me, and I think the council agenda was about enlargement at that point, but more about sort of accession countries like North Macedonia and Albania, who really, at that point didn't have much hope of getting in. And I don't know how it came up, but he was telling me about an enlargement summit they had with third countries, which is how the EU refers to non-EU countries, third countries. And during one of the joint summits that was being held by a third country, the council was producing paraphernalia, so leaflets, about advertising the summit. So the name of the summit, sending out tweets, doing a social media campaign, the photo opportunities. And a massive row had erupted over the colour of the choice of the paraphernalia used because the colour was green. And I was like, yeah, well, green maybe is not everyone's favourite colour. And he said, no, there was a massive debate and a quite an emotional argument because green cannot be used because green is the colour of the East, green is the colour of Islam, and blue is the colour of Europe. And I was like, really? Wow. And he was just telling me the story because he thought it was quite funny and like, oh, we made this massive screw up because we had green leaflets once. And I thought, wow, that actually really betrays civilizational thinking in the most sort of parochial and minor ways that the EU runs itself. Things that no citizen will ever know or things you never really pick up. So I remember just sort of being on my guard a little bit from that moment onwards. But it's always stuck with me when I see green things around the EU, in EU literature. And if you try to notice them in official communications, you won't. Everything is blue. And there's a reason for it, right? Because green is not our colour. Green represents something else. So I'm just going to start with that. And I want to make an argument which takes the concept of Eurowhiteness, which Hans has laid out as ethnic and racial, and I actually want to add an explicitly religious element to this. And I think it's really important that, as the book points out, the first mention of the term European, that term is born after the Battle of Poitiers, where Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, defeats the Umayyads in what at that time was considered to be a relatively inconsequential war, but then took on huge amounts of added significance because it was seen as stopping the northward advance of the Arab civilizations, who at that point were very kind of happy in Spain, made some entries into France, realised it was probably quite cold, not that nice, actually chose to stay where they were. But it does represent a seminal moment in Europeans' encounter with Muslim civilizations. And I think it's really important that that's where this term is born. And I'm going to make an argument saying that Islam has ebbed and flowed in the way that we think about European civilisationalism. But it's never really gone away. And if we want to understand about so much about what is happening with the project today, it's very difficult to ignore the Islamic concept. So I want to throw out the concept of, I want to problematize the notion of who gets to be called European and who gets to claim European identity for themselves. And my argument is that often Islam as a rival other, but more pertinently Muslims in Europe, so this is citizens of countries of Europe, have often proved to be the litmus test that help us define the limits of what Europeanness is. And I'm going to throw out some other sort of anecdotes. We can see this in clothing debates in France. We see this in the fact that, in Switzerland, refused to shake the hand of the person who was doing their citizenship ceremony. So they qualified for all the levels of citizenship, but they chose to put their hand on their chest and not shake the person's hand, and they were stripped of their citizenship. There's been legal cases where women have been refused jobs because they refused to shake the hands of their interviewers. And it seems minor, but if being European means having to shake people's hands, then and liking the colour blue, then really what does European really mean? And it seems facetious, but actually I think there's a lot of underlying ideology going on there. And to go back to Martel and to take this back to the 8th century, I think very early on you understand that if Europe is a civilization, it needs to define itself against something, and that often that civilization has been Islam. And we know that throughout the Middle Ages, one of the sort of clear parts of the discourse around the Enlightenment was to exclude Islamic civilization as being the legitimate inheritors of Roman and Hellenic intellectual traditions. And this is despite the fact that Renaissance in Europe was basically done because of the work done by the Arabs to pick up Plato, Aristotle and the rest, and to introduce them to Europe. And I think that is very important because from those early antecedents, Islam is excluded from being a legitimate inheritor of a European tradition. And it's sort of ignored. So we call it the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages because we assume nothing happened there and that Europe was quite a dead place. They were having lots of battles. There was no intellectual creativity here. It was happening in other parts of the world. But actually it was happening in Europe. But the people that were doing it in Spain, in parts of the Mediterranean, were Muslim. And therefore they've been erased out of that history. And I think we are still living with that legacy where Islam and Muslims, who are now the second largest religious minority in Europe, are still excluded from the sense of what it means to be European. And I think if we want to use the Eurowhiteness concept, we can add this extra dimension. And we can see it in the way we think about the geographical borders of where Europe is. So when Europe was a more avowedly Christian, and I want to say Catholic and Protestant continent, yes. Orthodox Christians were excluded from notions of Europeanness, and over time we have come to broaden our conception of what Europeanness means to allow Orthodox Christians to partake in this collective identity. And what is really interesting, so Hans, you talk about in the book that when the Eastern Bloc joins, it brings a different element to civilisationalism in Europe. Yes. And I want to argue that Western and Eastern Europeans probably disagree on a lot, but they find a lot of commonality in the way that Islam is used in both their discourses to assert an aggressive European identity. Now, if you're a Western pro-European liberal progressive, Islam is problematic because there's a values proposition there that you think is not aligned with what being pro-European means. And this is often the notion that Muslims are conservative in a way which means that they are not champions or promoters of LGBTI rights. The religion is misogynistic, it is chauvinistic, it has certain treatment of women, which as Europeans we cannot really accept as being part of our collective identity. And I think you see that in the far right in Western European movements and liberal movements in Western Europe play that sort of card. But in the East, Islam plays a really important role because Eastern European countries draw on their often military conflicts with the other, Islam, the Ottoman Empire, to say to them that we are legitimate Europeans because we have been the bulwark and the vanguard of this project and defending its borders against
the other for so long. That's why Hungarians, Poles, Bulgarians claim legitimate European identity. That's why they don't want to be seen as second-class citizens in any way, because they have played a historic role as the border between Europe and the rest.
Yes.
And that allows them to also partake and have a shared sense of European identity. So I think it's interesting that the secular, Western, progressive, pro-European, and to some degree a conservative, nationalist, Eastern European can still draw on Islam to say this is why we are Europe and this is why we want to make Europe in a certain way. And I think that's something that is part of the new trend that we've seen, and it's very clear. With the speeches of Viktor Orban when he talks about being an avowedly illiberal Christian democracy. This is Islam is often the battering ram that he uses to stoke up moral panic about what happens if countries like Hungary do not stand up for their values, despite the fact that his values might be exactly the sort of values that Western European pro-liberals don't want in their project. Yeah. But they can share that. And then there's just lots of examples of why I think Islam is this litmus test. Turkey hasn't been mentioned, but we already know that the perennial debates about Turkey, and let's forget what Erdogan is now. 15 years ago, he was the model student when it came to thinking about what non-EU countries should do in terms of reforming their economies, being part of a process where they can eventually accept the acquis and join the EU. But it was never really on the cards. Yeah. And I actually think there was a lot of honesty when in 2005 Merkel and Sarkozy basically said what shouldn't be said and said there is something about Turkey that is not ever going to be European, and we all knew what that meant, because Turkey is the modern inheritor of the other, which is often crystallized in the Ottoman Empire, and countries like Bulgaria, Cyprus to some degree, and Greece, their entire identity about being European is about the fact that they resisted the invader and ultimately, ejected the invader. Cyprus is a really good example. I mean, Cyprus is probably the only reason that it's in the EU as a legitimate member state is because it has a border conflict with Turkey, and it is the defining issue that Cyprus, uses at every sort of EU diplomatic meeting is its relationship with the Turks and North Cyprus, and they basically, jumped a lot of hoops to get into the EU because that was a civilisational entry. The other part that isn't mentioned a lot in the book, but something that is very important to me growing up was Bosnia and Kosovo. So the worst violent conflict, borderline genocide in Europe since the Second World War, and is also erased out of all of this narrative of Europe as a peace project. So, we often hear that since the European Union was formed, there has never been a violent conflict between nations on the European continent. Yeah. And I find that profoundly ahistorical, also quite offensive, given that one of the countries involved in that conflict, Croatia, is now an EU member state. And the EU's recognition of Croatia actually played an active role in stoking a lot of the ethnic tensions that happened in Sarajevo and in both the conflicts. And if you are, as those people are, white passing, if you are of a Kosovo, Albanian or Bosniak identity, you are white passing and you are a member of the former communist bloc or the Great Yugoslavia. But we know that conflict was a religious conflict, and it was a conflict where the Orthodox churches of Greece and Serbia and others made a 20th century crusade where the ethnic cleansing and the genocide was aimed at people who were not like them, and it brought a religious dimension into it. And I don't want to extrapolate from that conflict to say, well, all Europeans think this about Muslims, but I think these are very seminal moments in recent European history, which, as you say in other senses, have been airbrushed. And if we don't really understand the dynamics of what's going on, I think we're going to have lots of troubles as a 21st century continent, which is increasingly heterogeneous in the way that our societies are made up, to understand who gets to claim Europeanness or not. So I'm going to kind of stop there as my sort of my points for Hans to deal with, but to come back on and sort of introduce this element of why Islam is plays such a powerful explanatory force in thinking about how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, great. So shall I do another sort of 5 minutes or?
Yeah, great. Welcome to respond, and then we'll come on to the next part.
I'll be very brief. I mean, first of all, Mehreen, thank you for bringing in the religious dimension. I didn't want to get too sort of theoretical, but when I say ethnic cultural, that includes religion. The distinction between ethnicity and religion has always been a blurry one. And I think European racism has sort of always been about culture and religion as much as about skin colour. And I'm also influenced by the work of Etienne Balibar, who has this idea of neo-racism, which, as I say, is basically in the post-war period, which is, even more sort of about culture and religion than about skin colour as such. And so, even the far right, and I'm going to come back to the far right in a minute, they really talk about culture now rather than about sort of some biological idea of race. What else? I think a big part of, in a way, the story, another way of telling the story that I've been telling about the sort of, what I call the civilisational turn, is in a sense the sort of increasing influence of far-right ideas on pro-Europeans and on the EU itself. And so one of my big frustrations, part of what led to the book over the last decade, is that we've had this tendency to think in a very binary way. That there's, on the one hand, the pro-European liberals, and, on the other hand, there's the, Eurosceptic illiberals, and they're in this kind of elemental struggle with each other. If you think back to, say, the refugee crisis, when, Merkel was supposed to be the figurehead of liberalism, pro-European, and Orban was meant to be the figurehead of illiberalism, Eurosceptic, and yet the whole time they were both in the European People's Party together. They were political allies, right? And so I think this has been really unhelpful, the way this has been framed, and I think it's obscured, and frankly, the concept of populism has obscured, I think, a much more important story in Europe over the last decade, which is about how the centre-right and the far-right have converged, and in particular how the centre-right has kind of mainstreamed and normalised far-right ideas, particularly on these questions around immigration and identity and Islam. And by the way, since I finished working on the book, sort of in the spring, I think this has gone even further. And so since the book came out, I've been writing pieces about how we need to start thinking about the possibility of a sort of far-right EU, essentially. Because I think Maloney, is a really sort of paradigmatic figure here. The centre-right and the far-right are converging around a lot of all this stuff. So I think, I sort of, I'm mentioning this because you mentioned the far-right, and I think it is interesting to look at the far-right, but also then to look at the influence that has on more mainstream, centrists. And in particular, you talked about, this way in which, there's a sort of difference between how, people in Western Europe and people in Central and Eastern Europe think about Islam, but it kind of ends up being the same thing, right? And it's really interesting if you look at the far right, because, let me put it in this way, if you look at the Western European far right, the Dutch and the French far right, they hate Muslims because they're not secular, or they're perceived to not be secular. The Central and Eastern Europeans hate Muslims because they're not Christian. So in a sense, there's sort of diametrically opposed reasons for hating Muslims, but it kind of ends up being the same thing. And part of the reason for that is precisely what I mentioned a minute ago, which is that these things are quite blurry, right? So actually the position of Central and Eastern European countries is not really a theological problem with Islam. It's basically turned it into a cultural sort of ethnic question, right? It's not that you have certain religious beliefs. It's that you are Muslim in ethnic or cultural kind of terms. Very quickly on Turkey. Thank you for adding that, and it fits, in a way, it's a sort of, final piece of what I was saying about this contrast between the East and the South, right? Hard borders to the South, soft borders to the East. And Turkey, as exactly, as makes total sense, is sort of in between, right? Because it's in southeastern Europe. So unlike Morocco, which was told you can't join because you're not a European state, Turkey was allowed to start going through the process. Became a candidate country, but it was very clear, particularly in France and Germany, that however much structural reform Turkey did, there were some other ethnic, cultural, civilisational reasons why Turkey was never going to be able to join. And I'll just read you one quote which I have in the book, which is from Frits Bolkestein, the former Dutch commissioner. who says, and this is, as I say, at a time when he is a European commissioner, says that if Turkey were to be allowed to accede to the EU, it would mean, quote, the liberation of Vienna in 1683 would have been in vain. Right, which shows how as I say, this kind of medieval idea of Europe has persisted into the 21st century, right? Quite extraordinary. And then just finally on this peace project idea, thank you again for bringing that up, because just allows me to sort of add in another little piece, which is, I talked about the Eurafrica project. So, in that early phase of European integration, in 1950, when the Schuman Plan, the Schuman Declaration takes place, which is the beginning of the EU as a peace project, right? France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Indochina. And when 7 years later the Treaty of Rome is signed, the next big step in European integration, and by the way, that includes all the French and Belgian colonies in West Africa. And so if you look at a map of the territory covered by the Treaty of Rome, only a tiny piece of it is in Europe. Most of it's in Africa. It's quite extraordinary when you look at that map. But in any case, when that Treaty of Rome is signed in 1957, France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Algeria. And part of the point of European integration, and in particular including Algeria within it, was precisely the French hoped that this would kind of see off, Algerian independence. And so, what then, this idea that, the EU as a peace project, I think, what really happened is Europeans didn't decide after 1945 to stop fighting wars or to stop using military force. They just decided to stop using military force against each other. They're quite happy to fight colonial wars, against the rest of the world until they were defeated or exhausted. I think I'll stop there for now.